Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Catherine, thank you kindly for joining me in the garden today.
My
It is
pleasure.
not often that one can speak with the person whose work changed your life, and I am just overflowing with gratitude. I know many of you here are already familiar with Catherine's work, but allow me a short introduction. Dr. Catherine K Wilkinson is an author, strategist, teacher, and one of 15 women who will save the world, according to Time magazine. Her books on climate include the best-selling anthology All We Can Save, the Drawdown Review, the New York Times bestseller Drawdown, and Between God and Green. Dr. Wilkinson co-founded and leads the All We Can Save project with Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson in support of women leading on climate, and she co-hosts the podcast A Matter of Degrees, telling stories for the climate curious with Dr. Lee Stokes. Previously, Dr. Wilkinson was the principal writer and editor-in-chief at Project Drawdown. She speaks widely, including at National Geographic, Skoll World Forum, and the United Nations. Her amazing TED Talk on climate and gender equality has more than 1.9 million views, and Apolitical named her one of the 100 most influential people in gender policy. A homegrown Atlantan, Dr. Wilkinson holds a doctorate in geography and environment from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and a BA in religion from Sewanee. I'm really nervous about pronouncing this, and I did mess it up. Sewanee, where she is now a visiting professor. She is happiest on a mountain or a horse. Catherine, welcome to the garden.
Claire, thank you. I've been dreaming of this garden, and so even just to be in the garden on Zoom feels like such a treat.
Me too. I've been looking forward to it with bated breath for weeks. I am so happy that it's happening. Perhaps we could begin by talking about the path that led you to working in climate. And I'm curious to hear about your upbringing and what early memories awakened your love of nature.
So I grew up right in town in Atlanta, but for folks who have never been to Atlanta, what you may not know is that it is basically a city in an old growth forest. We have more old growth tree canopy than any metropolitan area in the country. And so, sort of, even though I was like a city kid, also not a city kid. And I spent time in the summers growing up with my grandmother in Tennessee on the Cumberland Plateau, which is kind of in middle Tennessee. And that was, sort of more like freedom nature child time. So I think that was formative. I have loved horses from the day I saw one. And so also that connection, I think, has always been a really vital part of, just sort of taking me out of the human world and into connection with other beings. So I think probably some of those threads.
Sounds magical.
Yeah.
I love the idea of you on a horse in Tennessee. That's that sounds like magic.
There was a pony named Dennis who was like my deep love affair as a child.
That's amazing. I did a lot of horseback riding in Brazil, but we never learned how it was like recreational activities in Brazil was just like put the kid on like an untrained horse.
Just go.
And the instructions I got was he's going to try to throw you off. Just don't let him do that. I was like, okay. And then
Great, I will try.
Yeah, but we survived, and I also love horses, so I love hearing about that.
Amazing.
So each of us have unique moments of waking up to the climate crisis and to feeling what Sherry Mitchell wrote, that we have fallen out of alignment with life. Could you tell us about the experiences that awakened you to the planetary crisis, and how did these experiences inform your work?
Yeah. Um, so when I was 16, I spent a semester of high school living in the woods in Western North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains with 25 kids at this pretty amazing experiential education school called the Outdoor Academy. And there was so much about those 4 months that were deeply awakening and politicizing and direction shaping for me. But one of the moments that I remember, and if you can hear I don't know if you can hear purring. I have a cat who's like very
tails drift by.
yeah, he's very keen to be present for all Zoom activities. This is with my, I guess, environmental studies class, and we spent a lot of time like crawling through rhododendron and reading poetry. But one day we hiked sort of up through this kind of valley in Pisgah Forest, super lush. It was cold at the time, so Coldwater Creek running through, and we came out onto this ridge line and into like a totally denuded, clear-cut mountainside. And it was the first time I had ever seen a clear cut up close. And I think that contrast of kind of coming through this thriving ecosystem and into just this like, what really felt like a graveyard, right? Sort of felt like the aftermath of this incredible violence, and I just remember the sort of emotion of that grief and kind of despair just washing over me. And our teacher, Tensley Daly, was amazing because she created space for that, right? So rather than just sort of talking about the mechanics of this and what happens to biodiversity and what it looks like for a forest to regrow, where it was to actually sort of make space for the emotional encounter that we would be having. And I have that journal still from when I was 16, and photographs that I took of that day. And I remember that as being sort of the probably the first moment that I ever just wept about planetary unraveling at the hands of extractive capitalism. And I think that time also was really formative for me because all of these experiences were happening within the container of a community. And so that felt like it created the space to really hold it and go there. And I think that has informed and shaped so much of how I've done the work that I've done going forward. And then in college, I remember thinking, okay, like if I'm now an environmentalist, I'm going to be working on these things probably for the rest of my life. And realizing that probably meant working on climate change. I had a friend in college, Billy Parrish, who was a really amazing youth leader at the time. He's not a youth anymore. Who did so much to activate the youth climate movement back in the early 2000s. And I learned a lot from Billy. And and yeah, that's kind of when my attention went more to climate and clean energy and all the rest.
Yeah. I love what you said, and I've heard you talk about this experience before of the trees and the clear cutting. And I listened to a really beautiful actually, like a webinar. It was with Sierra Club, and I believe the Women's Environmental Alliance. And there was an Indigenous leader from Tar Creek, and she was talking about nature. She said the creek is wounded, she's bleeding, and I really felt that sort of this. I mean, I would say it doesn't capture it to say the personification, because that means that you're attributing human qualities to something to therefore feel empathy, but like non-human empathies. I had several moments like this over this year. I don't know what it was about the pandemic slowing me down. I had those moments of really sobbing about nature. And one of them was doing this installation where I was foraging tree branches. And I had read about and sort of seen that the German forests are collapsing due to drought and climate change. But it was really something else to be touching and handling the branches and seeing how sick they were, and seeing, and I felt like the membrane between me and nature was so permeable. Like I felt thirsty for them somehow. And I think that what was so beautiful about the book that you created and the circle is that I finally, for the first time, had a space, as you said, the community, to talk about this, because it was like this huge grief that was really so core to my experience of this time. And I think that if it hadn't been for the book circle, I don't know what I would have done with it. So yeah, thank you. And that's actually a great segue into the next set of questions, because I really want to talk about All We Can Say. So you edited together with Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, All We Can Save, which is a gorgeous anthology of writings by 60 women at the forefront of the climate movement. Rolling Stone describes the book as, quote, a mosaic that honors the complexity of the climate crisis like few, if any, books on the topic have done yet. A feast of ideas and perspectives, setting a big table for the climate movement, declaring all are welcome. All We Can Save is so expansive. It is a real flourishing of richness, depth, breadth, and possibility. It was a book that so many of us, including me, really needed. Could you speak to us about this rising of female voices, this upwelling, and what you have called the climate feminist renaissance, and how you see yourself within it?
Sure. That Rolling Stone piece, just like, that was just making me tear up. We were talking about this earlier, Claire. You know, you sort of intend for something to land in the world in a particular way, but you just don't know until the thing is in dialogue with readers. And I remember that piece coming, and I was like, oh wow, it has taken life in the way that we hoped that it would. I think very much because it's also the book that I have needed, that Ayanna has needed. You know, I have been in climate in one way or another for over 2 decades now, and largely the climate space has not felt like home. Like, it's been this weird tension for me of feeling like it is the thing that I am supposed to work on, and also not my ecosystem, if that makes sense. And when I say sort of that ecosystem, the climate space, I mean, you know, sort of the conventional climate movement shaped very much by white male-led big green groups, and it's felt very bro-y, very technocratic, very like, come with your prefrontal cortex, but really nothing else, please, you know. And I think at some point I just felt so beaten down by the whole thing, and I felt so distressed that, like, the way the work was being done so much of the time, like, was thwarting our chances of winning. And actually really connecting with Ayana, we met via Twitter, and then we're also connected by kind of a mutual friend and colleague in late 2018. And it really cracked open the work that I had been wanting to do in the world, but wasn't sure how to do in the world, which I think is probably, that's how collaboration works, right? At best, that's how really good partnership works. And the climate feminist renaissance was actually a phrase that we sort of cooked up because I'd been extended a really unusual opportunity to curate a week at a ranch in Montana. And I wanted to gather a bunch of women in climate, I think largely because I'd been feeling lonely and isolated in my own work, and I knew so many other people had as well. And so sort of for the grant application, we had to give thing a name. We couldn't call it, Lady Climate Camp or whatever. We called it the Feminist Climate Renaissance. And in the lead up to holding that week, we also developed the proposal for the book that came to be All We Can Save. And I think upwelling is the right term because it is happening, right? I mean, it has always been there. Women have always been leading, but often without the access to resources, platforms, power, decision-making tables, all the rest that are needed and deserved. And we hoped that this book could be kind of one intercession in terms of amplification, collective amplification, obviously, of a subset of what this community looks like, but hopefully representative of what this community looks like in some way. And I think I think it's both about who is leading, but it's also about how we're leading. And I know we'll talk more about that, but there's I think there's a different way of showing up to this work that certainly I think I felt like I wanted to be able to do and did in fits and starts, but often kind of wasn't sure, right? Or was steered in other directions. Like when I was working on the TED Talk and I was told, you need to take all of the emotion out of this. And I was like,
that's ridiculous. That's the crazy. Eyes were sparkling in that. And I was like, oh, she's so sparkling. And you kind of teared up at the end, and it was amazing. You said that, I'm kind of going a little off script here, but I'm going to do it because
let's do it.
Something that I loved about the book is that it felt, the voices in it felt archetypal. I've been thinking about this a lot. I definitely see glimmers of myself in all of them. There's some chapters or voices that I maybe relate to more, but there's something sort of, powerful and archetypal about the different voices that you brought in, which I think is one of the reasons why the book is just so powerful. And another thing, I worked in policy for 10 years before becoming an artist. And I remember doing internships in DC, and I was much more about sort of social justice stuff. And I remember feeling, kind of chased off anytime I got anywhere close to the environmental organizations, which is bizarre because I clearly care about these things. But and that's why I remember I was like, God, am I even allowed to say that I'm a climate justice advocate? And I feel like just the fact that I felt so unwelcome is so nuts. And I think then I'm so glad that you and all of the women that you're working with are sort of opening up setting the table, welcoming everyone, because I know from experience I felt definitely unwelcome at the table.
I mean, I have a PhD in sort of the social science side of climate, and I've felt unwelcome, right? It's like, who is this for, right? And why has there been, it's been so, like, doesn't just basic logic tell us that we want as many people to join this team as possible? So like, what are we doing? Yeah, and it's been, I think it's been a place of like, show me your credentials, give me your bona fides, and a lot of like, sort of finger wagging, and I don't know. It's been weird. Let's just say it's been weird.
Interview that made me laugh hard. You were like, you said that it was like, if you go to a therapist, the therapist just is like, you're a mess. What's wrong with you? You're a disaster. And that was like the environmentalist movement's like PR campaign.
Yeah, you're like, oh, I feel really inspired to like grow spiritually now.
Okay. Anyways, that was my aside.
I'm really tempted to turn things around and ask you about your transition from policy to art.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, it had to do with a sort of like crash landing into Germany and feeling like completely disoriented and not knowing which way was up. And then a job honestly in policy in Berlin, and having kind of like a really kind of bad experience at the beginning. Germany is actually like quite misogynistic in their business culture, at least. There's very few. I had this rule that I instated at the age of, I think it was 28, that I only wanted to work for women bosses because I had so many bad experiences, and I just couldn't find it, like literally couldn't find one. So I was like, okay, so I worked for a year and then was really unhappy. And sort of in a nutshell is that I've always done art as a hobby, but then I was a mom. And then you have no time. And then, but I decided to do art. But I have to say that I really miss the policy social justice side. So it's constantly shifting Venn diagram. That's the mini version. But yeah, basically crash landing into a new country.
That'll do it. That'll mix things up.
Flying by the seat of my pants. So you kind of spoke to this already, but you really seem to work by building connections across disciplines and people and research. And it seems that given the scale of the climate crisis, this is really something that a skill that you have to have. And you did answer and I was going to ask you how you and Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson met, but my side question is, did the sky light up? Was there like, was it like a musical where everyone starts dancing?
I think a little bit. And on actually I think the first part of your question with all of these beautiful insects behind you is reminding me of my undergraduate advisor in college would say specialization is for insects, and like, with all due respect for insects, but I was like, yes, that speaks to me. Yes. Like, I've always liked the space of translation where kind of different sectors or communities or topics meet. Sometimes that has meant, making myself a little bit cuckoo, as was the case in my PhD, because I was like, I will bring all of these things together. It will be amazing. But when Ayanna and when we met, so I knew that this ranch opportunity was a possibility when we had a kind of just like a get to know you phone call, and I shared that with her. And now I know that this is, very kind of classic Ayanna. She was like, I'm in, like, that sounds great. I will work on that with you. Let's start a spreadsheet. And we like fired up a first Google spreadsheet. Google Docs have been kind of a running theme in our relationship. But then shortly after that, maybe a couple months after that, so like we knew we were working together, and I was in New York for work, and we got together for coffee, and we had such a great like first in-person date that I was like, do you want to get back together later? She had to go teach. I had to go to a dinner, and then we did in fact get back together later. And you know, and it was one of those like, okay, it's like well after bedtime. We have to shut this down. But I just, yeah, I think we had that sort of sense from the get-go of like there could be something really good here. And I think we had no idea actually how much of a, speaking of Venn diagrams, we would have in terms of our sort of skill sets and the ways that we think about things, but also how nicely complementary we would be in other ways. So it's been, yeah, it's been really beautiful and I think very lucky.
Yeah, we all enjoy it. You have our book circle, and many of my friends, we're fangirls of you and Ayana. It's also, yeah, I mean, also your podcasts. I mean, I'm also, it's funny because I can laugh out loud while listening, you know, to both of you speak, and
Yeah.
yeah, the camaraderie and the humor is also there, which is so nice and refreshing. Yeah, so the next, so I'm going to keep talking a little bit more about All We Can Save, because
Perfect.
so not only was All We Can Save just such a generous offering to the climate movement, but the reading circles were incredibly transformative. It was like the planting of so many resilient, beautiful seeds with deep roots. As Sherry Mitchell would say, the dandelion seeds of change. And you once wrote that, quote, "We know how hungry folks are for deeper, more generous dialogue about the climate crisis, and to circle up in ways that connect, nourish, and seed action. All We Can Save circles are designed to meet those needs, using the book as our grounding and jumping off point. This kind of work is vital to grow and strengthen any movement for social change." And I myself facilitated a reading circle that has been absolutely transformative. We meet weekly still, and we have women from diverse backgrounds. We have artists, academics, activists, a beekeeper, a clinical psychologist, and we're meeting on Zoom from all over the world. And I feel like it started off as a book circle and has developed into a sisterhood. Our book circle was truly life-changing for all of us. And I'm still trying to understand the profoundness of what unfolded in those hours together. It has become a space of deep tenderness and connection, intimacy, and spirituality. It allowed a safe space to really lean into something that we all feel so deeply, but that we don't often allow into our day-to-day. It has been, as I said, just utterly transformative. And really, you crafted magic. Can you tell us a bit about the process behind crafting these circles and the generous questions that you posed?
Claire, I can't tell you how much it means to me to know that that is how the circle experience has felt for you, and for the women in your group. The circles were, I think for me, kind of an outgrowth of a few things. So one is that I'm part of a monthly circle in Atlanta and have been for maybe 7 years or so now, that is not climate centered, but it has very much been the place where I've been able to take grief, rage, frustration with the movement, whatever, and sort of like compost that stuff, and feel nourished. And so I think I had carried with me this sense that like we need more of it, that for so many folks. And I studied religion in undergrad, so I've always been really interested in kind of what are the big questions that we ask and how do we ask those together, and in what forms and fashions. And my sense is that there's just this huge gulf of not having spaces to take these conversations, these explorations. So hoping that this book could help be a spark for that. And the notion of generous questions I learned from Parker Palmer, who's a longtime Quaker author, teacher, really amazing human being who I did a retreat with at the end of 2015 at a moment when I really was probably sort of one of the probably the lowest kind of professional moment of my life, and really grasping for like, where do I go from here? And the question, the sort of approach of generous questions that invite, in sort of Quaker terms, invite the inner teacher, right, to come out. I think is also just a thing that we don't do very much, right? Particularly on climate. It's like, tell me your facts and what's your policy and what about market-based mechanisms? And, like, sure, great, all of that. And if we are at all awake, we are asking profoundly existential questions in this moment. So how do we support one another in that? And I just kind of sat down and went through the book and sort of thought about the questions that they certainly kind of take their inspiration and grounding from what's in the text, but kind of take it up like to a slightly more not universal place, but just like a slightly higher order expansive place, so that it didn't depend on people being super connected to a particular piece in the book, but they could kind of leave it in the way that made sense. And they all follow a bit of an arc of kind of Marshall Ganz's framework of story of self, story of us, story of now. So trying to do some of that kind of deeper inner reflection, think a little bit more as a collective, and then sort of seed action. Again, not in an obnoxious way. But what's hilarious about this, so from the beginning of this project, people were like, no one buys anthologies, forget it. Basically our publisher was like, we'll sort of do this as a charitable endeavor, but like, this book is not going to do well. Which was true of 98% of books that were published last year in the pandemic sold less than 5,000 copies. So, and to break through with a multi-author book is like very unusual. And then with the circles, we were also told no one will do these. This is like the AP, class, and people want 101, like, just make a simple toolkit. And I was just like, I'm not that interested in a simple toolkit, but let's see if these go. And indeed, I think it sort of landed for folks and sort of the right thing in the right moment. And I'm so ecstatic that circles are continuing. People who've done them have started to fill out a survey, because we want to understand more about the experiences people are having, especially since we've never been in a circle. But more than 60% of folks who've responded to the survey have said their circles are continuing in some way, which is extremely cool.
Yes. I actually hadn't planned on starting a circle, and I got through the book and I got halfway through the section feel. Yeah. And I was in my kitchen, like washing my dishes and crying. so much. And I was like, I think I can't do this alone. And it's funny because
that's interesting.
Yeah, the week before the field chapter, we were already in the swing of things and things were going really beautifully. I was like, okay, guys, this is when I realized I needed a group. So, and it was a rough chapter to get through, but then, we came through it on the other side. And I think I needed that sort of link to go through that grief together. That was my sort of coming to needing a circle. Another really beautiful thing that happened over and over and over again was this feeling of thinking that I was alone in my feelings, and all of us thinking that we were alone in our feelings, and then seeing, so in the little boxes, seeing myself reflected back in the voices of other women, and everyone sort of feeling that that realization that it's truly a very shared experience, and that was beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. So the addition of poetry in the book was such an exciting choice. I've been moved to tears by a poem, and I often was in All We Can Save, but rarely by a policy brief. Or never.
Funny how that is.
Never have cried reading a white paper, no matter how sad the subject is, or how terrible the statistics. You often share poetry on your social media as well. How does appealing to the heart and not only the mind benefit this work?
It's funny, we did not include poetry in the original proposal for the book, which now looking back, I'm like, where were we? What were we thinking? But yeah, I kind of going back to that experience living in the woods when I was 16, that was when I started reading Mary Oliver's work. Like literature was a very big part of that experience for me. And I have often gone to poetry kind of in moments of despair, to find a way forward. And Ayana also loves poetry. So kind of at some point in curating the collection, it was like, we need space for people to breathe, and to feel and to know that they're not alone. And so then we had this sort of fabulous field day of going through various poetry anthologies and collections and looking for poems. And it's funny, I had really wanted us to include at least one poem in Drawdown, and I was resoundingly dismissed for that notion. So I think it also feels like validating for me. And there was a woman who said some months back now that some days she just can't take any more facts, and on those days she opens the book and reads a poem. And then some days she wants something really, kind of more like meaty, non-meat meaty, and goes to an essay. And I think that's just the reality of how we are as humans, right? Like very few people can live all the time in their rational mind, particularly when there's so much at stake. And I think that we've shortchanged our depth of understanding and motivation. But I think we've also, in kind of the failure to have more head-heart integration in a lot of climate leadership, we've shortchanged leadership, right? And I think about this term. This is actually also something that I started thinking about through Parker Palmer's work, that we move through the world like looking for integrity, right? In sort of the deepest, but also the simplest sense of like who you say that you are and who you are showing up as, like that there seems to be true wholeness of kind of the inner and the outer. And when we don't have that, like we don't trust. And so if you don't trust, like you're definitely not going to follow, right? And so I think part of it is about creating this currency of trust and connection, that kind of is the glue that holds the we together. And it's very patriarchal, right? Sort of this like obsession with the rational mind, at the expense of other faculties. And I certainly, I don't have a lot of regrets in my life, but I do regret the times that I was kind of convinced to like check some of that at the door. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the poetry interspersed throughout the book allowed the book to sort of seep into my being, like really into the fabric of,
Mm,
and um, and I think that that's also been something that has been surprising to me, but definitely true this year, is that waking up to climate and finding voices like yours and books like yours um, has led to this spiritual awakening, deepening for me. Um,
mm,
and I can't imagine that I would be as committed or have as much, as you said, integrity in terms of my
mm,
motivations coming to the space of climate if I hadn't had first that spiritual deepening. And I was thinking
yeah,
about this, I actually wrote it down, is that rekindling our spiritual connection to the earth is what will save us from extinction. Um,
yeah,
and realizing also how in other phases of my life when I hadn't had this feeling, how truly disconnected I was from everything. Um, and the
yeah,
and I think that poetry has the power to unlock that for us, sort of
yeah,
that spiritual depth. So yeah, I love the poetry. It was just incredible.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I think it's so true. And Sherry doesn't touch on this in her piece in All We Can Save, but I remember kind of hearing her talk for the first time a few years ago now. And she was talking about, like, so we know, right? We know from both science and from the world's wisdom traditions how profoundly interconnected we are. And when the living systems of the planet are fraying as they are, of course we feel that, right? We feel it, but oftentimes we don't know what it is that we're feeling. And so she was sort of talking about this in the context of, sort of the proliferation of antidepressants and other kind of ways that we numb because we are feeling
Yeah.
how profoundly wounded the planet is. And I think that gave me, in some ways, that gave me permission to go there, like to go into the depths of that. And then in sort of going into the depths, also sort of the retrieving sort of the fuel that is there also.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
about it in a way, since having this realization. I think there's a beautiful quote in All We Can Save, is that we have beautiful work to do before we die, is one of them. And
Mm,
just, and it kind of answers that question of like, oh, are you, hopeful or not hopeful? Are we going to make it? Or are we going to not make it? It's like, well, it doesn't matter in terms of the way that I wake up and how I'm going to show up, because of course I'm going to show up to
yeah.
help to heal. There's no other way to be. Um,
Yeah.
Another thing that this is another tangent and not something I planned on sharing, but I think that it's related and important, is that I don't
Mm,
think that many therapists and many psychologists have language for this. I actually broke
yeah.
up with a therapist in Berlin because it was this.
You got to go.
I
This is not working.
up with you. It's not. It's actually literally you, but it's okay. But yeah, I was trying to talk to her about how I was really feeling the trees, that they were thirsty. I was like, I feel like I'm thirsty. I was like, I feel like my skin is dry because the earth is so dry. Like I really,
Mm,
I was feeling it really deeply, almost like physically. And I think that she was like, oh, I think
mm,
you're projecting your inner dry, I don't know, whatever it was, drought onto the landscape. And I was like, no, the scientists are also saying that the earth is dry. Like, why would I not be feeling it? Like I'm in nature. And I felt
yeah.
really gaslit by the whole thing. And I
Mm,
think that this happens a lot, and reading Sherry Mitchell's words and reading All We Can Save and talking to
yeah.
you undid that gaslighting experience,
Mm,
and was like, of course I am part of the living earth. When she's hurting, I'm hurting, of course. Yeah,
of course.
yeah. I,
Yeah.
um, Can't
Yeah, more climate aware therapists. That is a specific solution. That would be great.
Yes. Yeah, that's a big thing that needs to happen, because that's the last place you want to get gaslit. It's there.
Yeah, and like, of course, I mean, of course, that's not part of their training, right? So it's like, it's so interesting the ways in which kind of like white dominant culture is like thwarts even the people
Yeah.
who could be helpers, right? In these moments.
I saw this great post today. It was said decolonize therapy, and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, right? Because sometimes
Yeah.
if you're trying to get liberated, then it's, yeah. Anyways, that's like a whole other guarded meeting. So this question is related, and we've touched upon aspects of it, but I think that what all waking up moments have in common is that they're really embodied. We are feeling them with our full and emotional selves.
Yeah.
And you once said that you can't fact someone into change, and yet this seems to have been the approach for the environmental movement for so long. Can you speak to, and I know you've already touched upon this, but if you have any other words about, you know, what heart-based climate action is and why it's so crucial.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the subtitle of the book, Truth, Courage, and Solutions, you know, clearly we need rigorous understanding of what's happening on the planet. Science is one of the ways we can access that, right? But so is, you know, intergenerational wisdom, lived experience. There are other ways, I think, that are critical for accessing truth. But then there's the question of like, what do we do with the truth, right? Where do we go? Where do we go from there? And often, kind of in sort of conventional climate communication, it's like, here's the bad news, bye. Right? Or here's the bad news, change your light bulbs. Right? It's like, it's a very strange kind of psychologically inept, emotionally inept approach, you know, and you sort of look back on it, it's like, what? And then you layer in the individualization of solutions, right? This is about what you are doing in your home and the way you access mobility and knowing that most of the solutions are profoundly systemic, right? We can sort of tinker, particularly those of us in, you know, in the global north with access to airplanes and vast quantities of consumption and all the rest. But so then we have people feeling guilty and ashamed, right? Not helpful. And then we have solutions that people are like, that sounds like it might make my life worse, actually, right? So then we just have all of this stuff kind of spinning around the system, keeping people on the sidelines, even if they understand the facts, right? Even if they're like, okay, I get it, we have a problem, but like, I don't really think there's anything I can do, or I don't want to do those things, or I'm going to try to do it all and I'm still going to feel like crap, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And that was part of what fueled my excitement about and my desire to join the team at Project Drawdown back in early 2016, that I just felt like there had been such a gap around telling a story of what's possible through the lens of solutions. And yet then I found myself going, okay, we've got some good truth, we've got some good solutions. And people would say like, well, Drawdown, you know, it's so hopeful. And I was like, maybe, or maybe it's a Shakespearean tragedy that we have this incredible toolbox and we refuse to use it at the scale and the speed that's required. And so I think that's what just sort of brought me back full circle to thinking about less about less about the what and more about who and how. And to that piece of courage, right? That if we've got truth and solutions, but we don't have that kind of fire in the belly and that determination, as you were articulating so beautifully, Claire, of like, of course we have to do this. Of course we have to try. Of course we don't know how this is going to turn out. Whoever knows how anything significant is going to turn out. But we show up and we keep going.
Yeah. I love that. and I agree with everything you said, and you have brought that into the movement. So yeah. And another thing that you say that I find really nourishing is that this is that the solutions to climate change aren't going to be ones of individual heroes, but rather of communities. And I think that that sort of collective nature of the work, and also it allows you to sort of like take off that burden if you need to, and it's like it's held collectively, and I think that that's so important, because it can feel really overwhelming sometimes.
Totally.
So I'm really curious to ask you about these, actually, because I haven't ever heard you speak about them so in depth. So you wrote a book called Between God and Green, and you also teach classes on theology and climate change. And could you speak a bit to this, of this Venn diagram of faith and climate?
Yeah. So I sort of stumbled into the study of religion as an undergraduate because I took one class, fell in love with the professor, fell in love with another professor in the department, and found that at least in my little small liberal arts college bubble, was the space where we got to ask all of the big questions, and we got to sort of draw on literature and history and anthropology and philosophy and ethics and I found that to be a really helpful space to be as kind of a budding activist, because I wanted space to grapple with questions about what are the stories that we tell, and what's our responsibility to this place and to one another. And so there was actually a lot in those years that I explored around the intersection of religion and the civil rights movement, the intersection of religion and Holocaust resistance movements. So kind of adjacent sorts of spaces. And when I then would step into kind of environmental academic spaces, it felt to me like so many of those big questions vaporized, and there wasn't space. And so I don't think that sort of religion and climate is the only way that we can access those, but I think it's a really natural space, because that's the bread and butter of religion, right? To grapple with big questions in community and across generations. And in my PhD research, I looked at what was at the time kind of a burgeoning climate movement among evangelical Christians in the US, largely because I was also interested in questions of breaking through a partisan divide, and how do we address political will and public engagement? Are there different ways into this conversation? And I remember feeling really, in some ways, quite envious of some of the leaders that I was interviewing, because it felt like, oh, wow, you have these theological resources to make sense of this thing. You have communities to explore that in, and to mobilize. And, of course, there's lots and lots of shadow side of the evangelical community in the US, but there was so much that I saw that I was like, oh, I would like some of that, and it's taken me, I think, longer to sort of cobble that together as someone who does not have a religious tradition. I've sort of pieced together, kind of a spiritual nourishment for myself, probably later in life than I wish I had. But I do think that in so many ways, the questions of climate are religious questions, in terms of, sort of ultimate meaning and significance. Yeah, that's kind of a rambly answer.
Bursting to tell you something. I am like,
yeah,
bursting, because about a year ago, when I was doing that installation with the tree branches, it was really like meditative. I was listening to a lot of books, and my question for that piece for myself was, what is the inner constitution that allows you to face the world as it is, so imperfect and unjust and so painful, and yet still be able to rise each day anew and keep fighting to make it better? And I was like, I was reading a lot of John Lewis's words and writings, and then oddly enough, like Mr. Rogers and Dolly Parton also got thrown into the mix.
Yeah,
and
I love it.
And at a certain point, I was like, I think I have to embrace Jesus. Like, that seems to be the ingredient to all these people. But I was like, I don't know if I can do that. So not really. And it was this really, I mean, this started a little over a year ago, sort of this open question, like, how do I build that inner sort of bedrock, whatever it is, what is that foundation? And I have to say that I think that I am on much more stable ground now. That wellspring of just new energy comes to me, partly because of this book and the circle. Like, I feel like on Fridays I really get to refill my cup, and that sort of deep embodied knowing was definitely something that was midwifed by the process of building. So
wow.
I just wanted to tell you that yes, I'm glad I don't have to become an evangelical Christian. But I'm also glad that I now, it's like that you have to be able to turn inward in order to keep going. And that was a question for me that you had to answer. So really, thank you.
This also brings up for me a profound desire that I have, which is how we get Dolly on Team Climate. I don't have the answer to that, but that's a dream of mine.
She loves the neon green moss of the Tennessee hills. I mean, she has so much nature imagery in her songs. Yeah.
Moss is the moss in Tennessee. I mean, don't come to Tennessee only for the moss, maybe also come for the whiskey and the music, but like the moss is pretty incredible.
Yeah, they were describing it and they were like, it's neon. And I was like, I need to go to this place. It sounds amazing. So this kind of ties into the next question. And is it, are you short on time? Is it okay if we go a few minutes over?
I actually think I have Ayana on the hour.
Okay.
But let's just squeeze as much as we can in the next couple of minutes.
You embody a beautiful choreography between grief and joy. And I think the stage for this dance, what holds and allows for the dance, is a very open-hearted and determined courage. And seeing someone like you in the climate movement made me want to get up and dance too. How do you bring this energy, what really feels to be your full and authentic self, to the work?
I think in some ways I'm still figuring out how to tend to all of that. I have a really dear friend, Laurel Grafey, who is probably my, we're friend soulmates from some faraway time and place, it feels. And our friendship has become also like a sort of an impetus and a space for re-anchoring into Gaia, into moss, into creeks, and like she is like, we go play in the woods together. And that friendship between the two of us and what is often the forest of Tennessee, has been really, really vital, both in terms of like actually leaning into nature as like an outlet for grief, and as a source of just joy and magic and sparkle. And yeah. And so sometimes I find myself feeling like incredibly unmoored in this work. And I'm like, okay, I got to get out of Atlanta. Like it's time for a Laurel weekend.
That sounds so
Yeah.
cool. I know you need
Yeah.
to run, but I am just so overflowing with gratitude for you taking your time to come into the garden. I'm really thrilled. And
Claire, I think your work is so beautiful. I cannot wait for a chance to actually experience it in person sometime. And I'm so grateful for the way that you're bringing art, and beauty into this conversation. Every time I pop onto Instagram and you have done some new magical thing, I feel really uplifted and nourished. So thank you so much.
That fills my heart. Thank you, Catherine. Okay. Have a good phone call.
See you soon.
Amazing.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.